and hello and welcome back. Yes, I have to say welcome back. We have been off the screen for some time, and there are reasons for that. Our top presenter, the man behind Security Update, he has been in Africa, even with these lockdowns and stuff like that, but he's been dedicated to go there and come and bring you news about Africa. This time, we want to speak about Uganda. We have made so many programs about Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Ethiopia, but we have never really discussed Uganda. And probably this is the right time to do so. As many of you, or if you're a Ugandan and you're watching this, you must know. We don't need to tell you. There has been so many bombs going off. There have been probably not probably, but we know that there is chaos, and especially there is one group which is causing chaos in Uganda. In fact, in DRC Congo. So now I don't want to take much of your time. It is not me who's going to talk about the group the ADF, but our trusted man, David Otto. He's going to be discussing ADF today. And but let us just have a small conversation with David. So, David, welcome back. Welcome back. It looks like a long time, but yet again, it's not really long time. So, we have been having conversations on the phone. Sometimes you are in Nigeria, sometimes you are in Uganda, sometimes you are in Rwanda. So, I think in this program, you are going to give us an insight of this group called ADF and how it started and why is it fighting? Why is it causing problems in Uganda? Over to you, sir.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Joseph. As you said, it has been a while since we had the security update for Africa, but it's been a reason, as you said. We've been engaged in traveling across the continent to actually speak to people and see what is going on. Now, this timing is very important because we're coming to the end of the year, to the beginning of 2022. So part of the security update is for us to try and evaluate some of those key areas in Africa which, has the biggest security issues. As you rightly mentioned, we've talked about Nigeria before, we've talked about Mozambique, we've talked about Somali, we've talked about the countries like Cameroon. So we've had all these conversations, but we haven't really talked about Uganda, and that came up the radar very recently as we saw attacks that were suicidal. These attacks have been blamed on the Allied Democratic Forces. I mean, as you're well aware, especially those who are based in the eastern part of Africa, especially in Uganda, the Allied Democratic Forces are terrorist organizations that they've been there for long, since I think the 1990s, early 1990s and 1995. So this is the group that we'll be talking about today. And the reason why we have to talk about that is because we have seen the impact of their attacks, not just in Uganda, but also, crucially, the links that the Allied Democratic Forces have with the so-called Islamic State. So they are now a lot more affiliated to the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, which is, the Salafist jihadist group. So that additional ideological component that the ADF has since its operations, I think as recently as 2000 and 15, 16, 17, is something that has drawn our interest. So we're going back to look at the historical component, the background of the Allied Democratic Forces. But of course, again, we will make mention of the fact that this is a group that, it doesn't really call itself the ADF, as many years back. Now it has transformed, and I'll talk about that, during the process. It's now called the Madina Al Tawid wal Mujahideen, which is, the city of monotheism. That's what it calls itself. But for the purpose of understanding, we would call it the ADF. But that is, the group doesn't call itself that any longer. It used to be the ADF, and that is why it's important for us to go back to the historical background. And the audience would understand again that the origin of the ADF lies with the aftermath of the current government that took power. Yoweri Museveni, when he took power from Milton Obote, you now had the remnants of some of these rebels that were not either happy with Museveni at the time, or groups that left, were affiliated to the Obote regime. They went to the bushes and formed all these various factions. I think, and then those factions then combined. I think some of the groups I did mention, I think it's important for us to mention some of them. They call themselves the Allied Democratic Movement, which was the ADM, was one of the factions that joined to form the ADF. You had the National Army for the Liberation of Uganda, the NALU, they called themselves, and then you also had the Ugandan Muslim Liberation Army and members of the Tabligh Jamaat movement. So these are some of the movements in the early 90s that put themselves together under this gentleman calling himself Jamil Mokulu. And Jamil Mokulu has been the somehow the significant figure of the ADF. But remember, the Allied Democratic Forces, even though they are known as a Muslim affiliated group. Jami Mokolo himself was a Christian, but this is somebody who went to study in Saudi Arabia and then converted to Islam. And then once he returned, he now joined the National Army for the Liberation of Uganda. So it's very interesting that he did not join the Ugandan Muslim Liberation Army, which was also a faction at the time, but he joined the National Army for the Liberation of Uganda. And that is why the name ADF doesn't actually sound well to the current ADF transformation movement. So which is what they call the MTN, the Madina at Tahid wal Mujahideen, because from an Islamic or an ISIS perspective, the Allied Democratic Forces can no longer exist because it has the name democratic, and the doctrine of the extremist Islamic groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda do not permit the ADF to continuously use that name ADF. So they are now much more internally known as the MTM, which is again, as I mentioned, the Madina Al Tawhid wa Mujahideen, the city of monotheism. So I think it's important for us to really understand the difference between how the media calls these groups or labels them and how they label themselves. So I think that's very, very important, for the audience to really know that. So that is a bit of the background. But I think what is important to also note about people like Jamu Mokulu, who, of course, we have to make mention of the fact that he was arrested. And that was in 2015. He was arrested by the Ugandan Special Counterterrorism Forces. And I had the opportunity to speak to the director at the time who established the Ugandan Counterterrorism Forces, and he made it very clear the very operational strategy, the experience that the Ugandan, they called him the UPDF, the Ugandan police services, the Ugandan army used in tracking down Jamil Mukulu. I mean, Jamil Mukulu is somebody who, look at it from the 90s, from the early 90s up until 2015. He had been, as the figurehead of the ADF for so many years, and he had been eluding the security forces, moving his group from the borders of Uganda into DRC. So the ADF was a group that, some people described them as mercenaries for hire. They were being used by, organized crime groups, to loot. They were being used to extract mineral resources and sell them to the best bidders. They were being used to launch attacks. So that region between Uganda, DRC, Rwanda, they all experienced a huge presence, even as far as Tanzania, in terms of the links that ADF created. But again, what is very important is the kind of tactics that they used. They operated within the rural areas. They spent a lot of time in the bushes. But one thing which the ADF did, which I think is one can compare with groups like the Lord Resistance Army of Kone, was that they used children. They used a lot of child soldiers. And when you speak to people that understood how the ADF operated, and how the Lord Resistance Army operated, so this was like a common tactic, which was on one hand, a way of increasing the capacity of the group, but on the other hand, it was also a demonstration of the how desperate and how evil these groups were, in terms of how they brainwashed little children as soldiers. They used them to assassinate people. So these tactics of using child soldiers is something that has been a long standing operational tactics of insurgency groups within that area. So it is no doubt that even when we talk about the current ADF at this point in time, we still see that increase in the use of child soldiers. We saw that with ISIS itself. We've seen that with groups like Boko Haram, the Islamic State of West Africa Province. We've seen child soldiers being used in Mozambique. So it's very, very common now for groups of this nature, or insurgency groups, to use child soldiers. So I think it was very important that we make mention of that, because this historical background of the ADF is very, very powerful. But let's come to people like Jamil Mukulu that champion this group. Now remember that he is somebody that, from his ways that he was operating, you could tell that Jamil Mukulu had a lot of links, not just within Uganda, but also within the region. Talking to people that knew him and doing some research about Jamil Mukulu, he's somebody who had about 7 or 8 different nationalities. I mean, he's someone who, at one point, I think he was a Cameroonian. He had a Cameroonian passport in the name of Ngahane Fuba Roja. That was between I think 2003 to I think 2010 or something like that. I think he was then, at that point in time, the passport showed that he was resident in London. That's the United Kingdom. And he had a date of birth of the 23rd of March 1965 in that particular passport. The same passport that he used as a Cameroonian national, he used that same passport as a British national And at that time, I think he obtained the passport in 2009, April of that same year, and he called himself Calamari Pantaguli. So you can tell that he's somebody who had multiple nationalities. We also found that he had about, I think, three or four Ugandan nationality, and one of them he was called Janzi Yasefi Philip, and then he had a date of birth of 1952. His profession at that time as a businessman. Another passport that was found to have been used by Jamil Mokulu was Jamil Alibaba, date of birth 17th of April 1964. And then he had another Ugandan passport with the name Denis Musoke, and that was again the date of birth of June 1958. So you could tell that, again, I think there's another one, Thomas Masasi. So he had so many different nationalities. He had a Tanzanian passport in the name of Julius Elias, date of birth 1965, place of birth, Bagamoyo. So, this is somebody who had multiple identities. And when you look at all these multiple identities, what it tells you is how connected Jamil Mukulu was, when he was the leader of ADF. Again, remember, he was arrested in 2015. He was well connected. He had the ability to obtain different nationalities. Now, it is not clear whether these nationalities were obtained legally or they were obtained illegally. I think that's a matter of investigation, but these are nationalities that Jamil Mukulu has used in the past, and they were found in his possession, and he had confessed during the time when he was arrested of having used these various nationalities to evade the Ugandan police forces. So I think it's interesting to really understand the background of Jamil Mukulu and how the group has expanded. So coming fast forwarding that, Mr. Joseph, I think then coming to the attacks that we've seen recently, where we now see the group has moved from the concentrating on fighting the Ugandan government under Yoweri Museveni to the point where now they are now affiliated with ISIS, and they'll be moving towards the DRC and all that. So we'll talk about that in a minute, Mr. Joseph.
Okay, now that is very, very, very exciting, because you see, when you see these people actually operating such organizations, we know that whatever they are fighting, we know they can never win or to get in power, but they have got some level of intellect whereby they can actually create chaos without even being detected. Thank God for the security forces in Uganda; they managed to catch him. But now, from Jamil Mukulu, let us talk about this guy Musa Baluku.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Tell.
I think it's important to understand that Musa Baluku, who is now a commander, so he's not yet he doesn't have the kind of personality that Jamil Mukulu used to have when he was the almighty leader of the Allied Democratic Forces. Musa Seka Baluku was a commander at the time, and he grew up as an imam. He used to be the spiritual leader of the Allied Democratic Forces. He was very close to Jamil Mukulu, and of course, when Jamil Mukulu was arrested, Musa Seka Baluku, who has a date of birth as in 1977, he took over from him, and since then, because of his ideological prowess, the fact that he's very, according to sources, he's a very charismatic speaker. He has been able to turn the group into what we see today, and he's the one that has been affiliated, to align the ADF with the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. and the ADF is now known as the Islamic State of Central Africa Province. So that's where the head of, or the headquarters of the Islamic State of Central Africa Province, so called. That's where it is now situated. So you can see that Musa Seka Baluku is somebody who is now leading an entire affiliate of ISIS, in the eastern part of Africa. And remember, Joseph, and I think the audience it's important to note that Musa Seka Baluku, he is the one who has been infamously credited for linking up the ADF. Again, I remember I said, it's now called the MTN, which is the Medina Al Tawit wa Mujahideen. They are now affiliated again with the Islamic State affiliate in Mozambique. So he has expanded ISIS presence not just within Uganda, but across Congo DRC and as far as Tanzania, as far as Mozambique. So all this affiliation with ISIS, is thanks to Musa Seka Baluku. So what we have seen is one leader, Jamal Mukulu, moving the group from an angle of we want to strengthen the presence and the of Muslims in Uganda, to the point where we have another leader, which is I'll put that off. The points where we have another leader that has now taken the group to be affiliated with the Islamic State. So this is very important to see the difference between how Jamal Mukulu used to operate and how someone like Musa Seka Baluku has taken the group to another level. So I think this is very key, and I'm sure that is what you were talking about, Mr. Joseph, in terms of his leadership and the attacks that were carried out recently in October and November in Kampala, which led to the death and injury of so many police officers. This attack, happened around the parliamentary circle, but also where the Ugandan Central Police is. Significantly, this comes at a time when we're talking about Africa being stable. We're looking at the stability of Africa, and so the impact is there. The impact of the leadership of Musa Seka Baluku is there, and I'm happy to see the coordination that is now happening between Uganda and DRC. But I'm sad that we still do not have that triangle. That's Uganda, DRC, and Rwanda. Speaking in the same voice. To launch a very coordinated approach. So it's interesting to see how the leadership has changed, Mr. Joseph. But also, I think it will be more interesting to see how these three countries, Uganda, Congo DRC, and Rwanda, can work hand in gloves, to ensure that they can fight a common front, and not just do it individually.
Okay,
Over to
so
you.
yeah, so now I just want to phrase this question. I don't know how I can actually phrase it. I'm trying to find the right angle. You see, a group like an ADF now, which is calling MTM, for them to join alliance with ISIS, is it because they want actually to affiliate themselves with a group that is known to be strong and terrorizing, causing chaos? But they also are aware that ISIS has its strength has actually weakened. But how do they do it? Is it because they know if they don't affiliate themselves with a certain group, they have no chance of being taken seriously or even winning their objectives? What do you think?
Very important observation, Mr. Joseph. I think there are different angles looking at it. The first angle, as you rightly said, is A group like ADF that has transformed itself to Madina Al Tawhid wa Mujahideen, from a Christian name to a Muslim name, wants to be affiliated with the most infamous Muslim terrorist group in the world, and there is no other better group for them to have an affiliation with than ISIS. So it's all about the symbol of affiliation, that network, creating that network. But it's also about the leadership, and that is why I mentioned that the background of someone like Jamil Mukulu, who was a Christian and then converted to a Muslim, is very different from the background of Musa Sika Bahuluku, who has been an imam throughout. He's been a scholar, and that means he has the ability to convince the Islamic State that they can create a separate entity, or some kind of a province in the central part of Africa, which has not existed before. So with that kind of a background, it helps, that ideological affiliation that the leader has actually helps, in the group. But in terms of the impact, it is not that they will have as much support in terms of material, but they would have much more some kind of an ideological support, for affiliating themselves with the so-called Islamic State. But also, there's also a possibility that they may, have, material benefits from, groups that are much more happy to contribute towards the emergence of, Islam, towards the form of doctrine that they're practicing. But in practice, what I see with the ADF is an organization that is a lot more a criminal group, that is exploiting the natural resources of the areas where it operates, than a religious group. But religion is just being used as a cover, and also a mechanism to brainwash, some of the recruits, to believe that they belong to some religious movement. When in fact, if you look at the way that they operate, if you look at the kind of activities that they carry out within the region, even in DRC Congo, in the northern part of Uganda, you do not see any component of religiosity within that, or any idealistic Muslim practice there. What you see is an organization that is a lot more criminal, an organization that is more interested in enriching itself. So the affiliation with ISIS, it's a balancing game that most of these groups play. It is not that they really have the same, some kind of legitimate religious reason, to carry out or their activities. I mean, there is a very low possibility that we would see the ADF or the MTN taking over power in Uganda. They don't have that kind of capacity. They don't even have that kind of ambition. So when they call themselves or they affiliate themselves with the Islamic State of Central Africa Province, I think it's just a name, and it's just purely for benefit.
So now we have been talking about the background of the ADF, and we have actually seen you have very eloquently put it, explained as usual. Now, I think where we are now, there are still some attacks going on, even Christmas, Boxing Day. These guys came up and attacked a restaurant, and 16 people were killed. I'm sorry we don't have the images right now, but we're going to be showing you the images now. I want to put it this way. The Ugandan army actually seems to be strong, and the Ugandan army is very experienced in hunting such a groups. Like if you remember the Konyi, is the LRA. You have actually put it, you have almost answered the questions. The questions that we are, viewers, they will be asking you or myself. They don't have an ambition to be to be in power. They don't even there are no actions that supports them religiously. Now, where we are now, the Ugandan army now, the is it UPDF? They are in. In your estimation, do you think it will take? How long? How long will the PDF take actually to get these guys flashed out, or chase them away, or just drive them deeper into the jungle like Konyi's forces?
Yes, I mean, you're very correct. I think one thing which the audience also has to know is the fact that uh, Konya's LRA is still there. I mean, they are still operating up until today. He has not been arrested, and so we still have him. And his group there. I mean, the U.S. pulled out, I think, a couple of years back and said, we are no longer interested in chasing him because there is no realistic option of us capturing him. I think the other point, which has to be noted, is that the so-called ADF has been there since the 90s, and um, the question is, why are they still there until now? They've been having a very structured leadership. They have. This is a group that had a hierarchy under Jamil Mukulu. People that had various positions within the logistics, the military side, the ideological components, launching attacks. So it's been a well-structured group for some time, and the group has been allowed to flourish, for a very long time. They've, solidified themselves within the northern part of Uganda into the northern part of Congo, especially within the Kivu region, where they have carried out significant attacks. So this is a group that has been, accused and has been, linked to several deaths of both Ugandans and Congolese and foreigners, and people have lost, limbs. People have, been displaced as a result of the presence of this group. So it's been there for a very long time. And the question is, why hasn't there been an effective strategy by these governments, the government of Uganda and the government of the DRC, to work hand in gloves and deal with these groups? And I think, over the years, we've seen both countries accusing each other of using these groups, when it benefits them, to destabilize the other. The Congolese government has often accused the Ugandan government of, coming into the northern part of DRC, especially the Ituri region. We've seen clashes which happened in the 90s and early 2000s, whereby the Congolese government is even claiming compensation from the Ugandan government up to the amount of about 13 billion, for damages. So the question of why there hasn't been any solution, and if there will be any solution so soon, is one that it's quite challenging, because even though we have seen the Ugandan and the DRC government coming together and saying, okay, let's put our forces, but this strategy has been very reactive at best. We've seen airstrikes, ground air strikes being launched by the DRC forces and the Ugandan forces against the locations of this group. But it's very difficult in a very huge region of that manner, in a very thick forest, to really have the kind of impact. You can march your 10,000 troops up the hills, and you can march your 10,000 troops down the hills of DRC, up the hills of Uganda, to look for these forces, to look for these terrorist groups. But if you don't have a comprehensive strategy, they will always have ways of escaping. They would always have options of hiding into very deep and complicated locations. And I can tell you that this is not a small region, and the fact that the ADF has been around for a very long time. They are working alongside some of the LRA groups. It means that most of these offensives that have been launched with soldiers being shown on television, walking down the roads, and this is not where they would find the ADF. This is not where they will find these rebels. These are rebels that would have local contacts. As long as people are there to give them information and intelligence on these some of these operations, it will be very challenging, for these governments to really succeed in actually having a significant impact on this group. So I think, yes, on one hand, the government of Uganda, and the government of DRC Congo, after all the attacks that have been carried out recently, they have the moral obligation to demonstrate to the public that they have the firepower to go against these groups. But it is one thing in deploying this firepower, is also one thing in making sure that this method is effective. So the government has the right to protect its territorial integrity, but whether this is going to be the end of the ADF, I'm not sure. Counterinsurgency operations are very, they have to have a much more comprehensive strategy. I mentioned earlier on that we don't have the participation of Rwanda, and Rwanda is also a very significant partner in that region. If you allow any areas, any loopholes, these groups can easily move into Central African Republic. They can easily move to Chad. They can easily move towards Rwanda. So there are so many other loopholes that are existing, which these groups can easily go into. So I think what we have seen in terms of the counterinsurgency response, of Uganda and DRC, it is normal that they have to respond this way, especially with the recent attacks that have been carried out against civilians in both countries. But is this going to be effective? It's difficult to measure the effectiveness, but it's also very simple to understand that even when you hunt down these leaders, or you kill some of these militants, as long as you don't deal with the underlying issues, as long as you don't have the ability and the manpower to protect these very large ungoverned spaces and ungovernable spaces, then it's going to be very challenging. So in 2022, we are still to see how much collaboration will be done to fight against the ADF or the MTN. But for now, I think this should be the priority of the region. And I would like to see a coordination of the East African community. I would like to see the coordination of the South African community, because, of course, there are links between the ADF and the ISIS faction in Mozambique. So what Rwanda is currently doing in Mozambique, what South Africa, what Botswana, Tanzania, they are doing in Mozambique, I want to see the same kind of strategy happening around the borders of Uganda and the borders of DRC. We need an African-led coalition. We don't need to continuously rely on European countries to come to our aid. So while the coordination between Uganda and DRC is seen as a regional coordination, I think we still need more. We still need more. Again, firepower is not the full answer, but it is just part of the answer.
So, you have actually rightly put it. In terms of firepower, the ADF won't stand a chance. But does Uganda have the intelligence And if they have, or if they don't, of course they must have the intelligence somehow up to a certain degree. Otherwise, they wouldn't be uh, pinpointing targets. What kind of intelligence is needed? Just a minute. What kind of intelligence is needed actually to defeat these guys?
I think when it comes to intelligence, Mr. Joseph, you're very correct. Every the principle um, of every counterinsurgency operation has to be led by credible intelligence. And you're right that you can have the firepower, you can have the weapons, you can have the air power, you can have the manpower, but as long as your operations are not led by credible intelligence, then it becomes very challenging. And intelligence is not just getting information; it's getting information on time, being able to assess the credibility of that information on time, being able to distribute or share that intelligence with the various security agencies that might be responsible for acting on that information, and then having the capacity and ability to act on that information, at the time when it is required. So I think you need a lot of human intelligence, because of course human intelligence is the fundamental backbone to any counterinsurgency operation, without which anything else will collapse. You need a lot of signal intelligence because again, these guys are operating in a very remote area, and it means that you need to probably use your aircraft, for surveillance missions, for reconnaissance missions, to gather some movement, intelligence of movement, and then you can collaborate. You can collaborate that information that you get with the people that are on ground. So I think what is happening here is there are two major scenarios here. First of all, both the Ugandan government and the DRC government have to be able to win the support of the local populations that exist within those areas where these groups operate. Secondly, they need to have the ability and the equipment to be able to carry out surveillance in the areas where these groups operate, where you cannot have access to the local population in those areas, because again, that region is a very deep forested area. So a combination of human intelligence, a combination of signal intelligence. Um, I don't think you would, of course, you need some kind of social media intelligence, but not as much, because these groups are not, especially the ADF, does not really have that much media activity. But again, it's not something that you can discount. So it's a combination of these kind of operations. But I think more importantly, Mr. Joseph, it still goes down to human intelligence. But human intelligence is not something that you design and you build overnight. It takes time, and that is why, for me, even when you launch those offensive, how do you even know whether you got the targets or not? Because you don't have assets on the ground. You don't have people that can relate back to you and say, okay, this particular airstrike killed this number of fighters. If you don't have that, then again it's like you're fighting a blind war. So what I see is a lot of firepower being displayed, but this is important for the people. People, the government wants to show the people that it has the monopoly of force, that it can launch attacks. But in reality, if you don't have enough human intelligence on ground to confirm and collaborate or corroborate, your actions, then you're just fighting blindly. And that is what I see at this point in time, except um, there is more evidence that I'm not privy to.
Okay, this is how I say it. If these fighters are in Ituri forest, it is part of the Ituri forest. Ituri forest is 24,000 kilometers, square kilometers. So it looks like that if the ADF are frightened by the firepower, They can they can run maybe 100 miles away from the very spot that they are. So if they don't have this, even the local intelligence, the village people, to actually to send these messages and say, well, look, these guys here, they have been in this village today, or they were here last month. If you want to track them, find them there. I think this is what the challenge is. Actually, you have put it rightly. They can send in as many tanks as they like. They can send in aeroplanes, but if they don't have this human intelligence, or local intelligence, so and who is advising these the Ugandan army? They must have an advisor.
Yes, of course. I mean, you make a very good point there, Mr. Joseph. Um, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And one of the things that we've noticed with these groups that operate within the forest region, we've seen a lot of that happening in Mozambique, is that they dig tunnels. Even though they are living in those forests, they still dig a lot of tunnels in which they hide, during the night, for several reasons. Some of them, they don't want to be rained upon. They, are afraid of wild animals, so they live under the tunnel. So even when you launch these airstrikes, it's again very difficult for you to really have that much impact. You can be lucky, but I don't think you can base your strategy on luck. So when you see these airstrikes being launched, the question is, do they really have the intelligence? Do they really know the targets? Where these people are? Do they have assets on ground? So it becomes really, really challenging. When you do not have, you don't, when you don't spend on your human intelligence for a very long time. You don't develop that for over a period of time. And also there is a very, as I mentioned earlier on, there is no real trust between the Ugandan and the Congolese government. Again, this is because of historical precedents where the Congolese have accused the Ugandan government and the Ugandan army of exploiting the conflict, to mine its resources illegally. So that trust is not there, and even the Congolese people themselves, when they see the Ugandan forces marching within their boundaries, yes, they welcome them, but can they really rely on them for information? Can the Ugandans rely on the Congolese for information? Do they speak the same language? Yes, it's a joint operation between the DRC and the Ugandan forces. But remember, in the DRC, they either speak Lingala or they speak French. In Uganda, they speak English, or the local, Ugandan language. So it's, communication can also be a significant factor, in terms of, that collaboration and coordination. And the reason why I mention this is because when you see these very quick preemptive strikes which are being carried out, and you see these operations which are being launched very, very quick, it tells you that, the response is fast, but the planning and preparation is very slow. So, the key to an effective counterinsurgency operation is, the longer and the more effective you take time to plan your operations. You understand the culture of the people, you understand what you're doing, where you're going, who is going where, who is talking to who, how is the command and control. Then it becomes quite easy for you to have some effectiveness. But what we see recently is a government that is reacting to the suicide attacks that were carried out in Kampala and the attacks that were carried out in DRC Congo. Again, that is the choice of the government. They have to react. But what I want to see, and I think what Ugandans want to see and Congolese want to see in 2022, is more coordination, is to see a government that is not just reacting, a government that is proactive, ensuring that, the strategies that are being deployed, they are taking into consideration the people, some of the reasons why the people join, so don't leave the group to exist for 20 years, and then the day you're attacked, you then launch a massive attack. It says a lot about the fact that the government itself it's not really prepared to find a lasting solution. But I hope again that 2022 will be a year that most African countries, will look back and say, this is the time when Africa can begin to understand the importance of having a strategy that they can do on their own, whether it's in the Sahel, where you've got the ISIS and Al Qaeda groups there, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's in Somalia, in Mozambique, in Cameroon. I think it's important for Africa now, or in Ethiopia. Africa needs to take the lead in dealing with the conflicts that exist within its borders, because I can guarantee you that the more we have these conflicts in the east, in the west, in the Sahel, in the central, in the north. We've seen in the case of Libya, they still have not been able to have elections. So the entire continent, is in chaos, and we've spoken about this several times. But I think the solution is that these governments have to be serious about their strategy. They have to ensure that their strategy is not preemptive, it's not reactive. These are well thought out, processes in terms of how to launch attacks. But more importantly, deal with the underlying causes. Spend more resources in dealing with the underlying causes, so that you don't have to fight them tomorrow. I mean, I think that should be a very clear message, to the Ugandan and the DRC governments. While you're fighting, make sure that you're developing, because bullets and guns, will not solve the problem. What I think will solve the problem is education, development, and stability.
Good. So now, this is how I see it. As you have mentioned, the group was started in 1995, and they have been there actually causing chaos in those borders of Rwenzururu, which we call Rwenzori, at the borders of Uganda and Congo. Throughout 2017 or 15, there were activities actually to contain these guys. I think probably the Ugandan government relaxed by thinking that we have actually contained them. They are not going to come back and attack. Until recently, until the bombs started going on in Kampala. You have already mentioned that. Why leave the group which is causing chaos for a long time? Do you think that the intelligence and the ability to keep momentum is lacking in African nations, not only in Uganda?
Definitely, I agree with you. I think the African nations at this point in time. I have traveled to so many African states, especially looking at the security architecture, and I think one thing which is very much lacking is the fact that African governments do not spend resources, on information. They don't spend resources on data. They don't have, data centers. They don't pay attention to, the key to any security is, information. And I think when you don't have information, you cannot carry out an effective strategy, irrespective of how much materials and weapons you have, in terms of resources you have. You need information. So I think the bedrock, from my understanding and my experience with African countries, is that the intelligence community is not well funded. In some countries, it's lacking in terms of it's in structures. It's lacking in terms of the kind of knowledge that people have, and there is this tendency to always believe that the more weapons you have, equates to how powerful you are. But what they forget to understand is that you can only act on information. You can only act based on the intelligence that you have been able to gather, that you've been able to analyze, disseminate, and act upon. So I think you're very correct, Mr. Joseph. I think the priority for African countries is to be able to utilize the local methods of information gathering, but also enhance that with much more innovative scientific methods, of information gathering, whether you're using um, technical equipment or online equipment, or you're using people on ground. There has to be a huge investment in that. I mean, the reason why the United States is powerful, the reason why China is a powerful nation, the reason why the United Kingdom is credited for its strength in security is because they have the power of information gathering. They invest in information, especially when it comes to security. It's about who you know, what you know. It's all about information. It's all about that data. So I think it's very critical that before within 10 years or within 15 years, African states should be able to have that independent capacity. I mean, even to the point where they should be able to deploy satellite, to gather information on what is going on. So information is very important, Mr. Joseph, and there is no doubt that if you look at the existing strategy that the Ugandan government is using, I'm not saying they don't have information. I'm not saying that they've not had information for years, but you can tell that it's been much more of a reactive counterinsurgency operation than a proactive one. Again, the Allied Democratic Forces, the LRA, they've been there for years, and it will not take 1 week, or 2 weeks, for you to eliminate them. And the method in which it is being deployed is a demonstration of the fact that there's still much to be done. So we are hoping that lessons will be learned. We are hoping that Africa will be led by its the African Union. Hopefully that especially the fact that we're seeing some chaos happening in Ethiopia as well, that doesn't destabilize the heart of the African Union, which is the headquarters. So let's hope that we can see some improvements. We still have issues in Sudan, again as I mentioned, Mali, issues in Niger Republic, in Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Cameroon. The entire country, Central African Republic. Why is because we don't take our security seriously, and I think it's high time we do that, Mr. Joseph.
Okay, so if you were to advise, this is another thing. You know what? I have been saying that we need to see African advisors or African people who can talk about security in a way from a historical point of view and from the practical point of view. If you were to advise African countries, I know which you are doing. I don't know how they are receiving you, but what would you advise them? You have already mentioned that they need to have the information is the core of everything. Whether you've got planes, whether you've got massive tanks, they won't do anything if you don't have the information or the intelligence. Would you advise African governments to invest more and more, or even to more advanced technological information gathering, rather than buying equipment, but also training their own people to understand what it is that the dangers that they're dealing with? What would that be? We have got only 3 minutes, actually.
Yeah,
1
I
minute.
think you're very correct. I mean, I continuously talk about what I call the triangle of engagement. The triangle of engagement is very simple. It's all about at the top of the triangle you have what you call knowledge acquisition, and knowledge acquisition means knowing knowing your enemy's capability, knowing his background, his capacity in terms of finance, where he gets his support from. Knowledge capability can only be attained if you have information, if you have the ability to build on your information. So that's the first advice I often give to African governments: build on your knowledge, build on your understanding and your expertise of your threats within your country. So that first part of the triangle is very important. Now, the next part of the triangle is what? Is your responsibility. How do you connect your knowledge with your responsibility? Because it's very simple that the more knowledge you have, the more responsibility you can take. The less knowledge you have, the less responsibility you can take. But what often happens in Africa is that people are taking too much responsibility with very little knowledge. You're carrying out a very important strategic operation with very little intelligence, and at most of the times it becomes counterproductive, because you then carry out maybe mass casualties of civilians, or you spend billions in buying all these weapons, and it then cripples your economy, because the difference between what the terrorists can spend in launching a massive attack is very little to what the government can spend in retaliating. So you see that there is an imbalance there already. What's the last part of the triangle? The last part of the triangle is your what you call your situational control. The more knowledge you have, the more responsibility you can take, and the more you can control a particular situation. So my advice has always been to look at that triangle and see how you can build your knowledge capacity first, because that's the most crucial. And if you look at what I call the Otto's triangle, which is motivation. So you want to know what motivates your enemies, what motivates the ADF, what motivates Boko Haram. You first of all want to know, and how do you know it? Again, it's still down to knowledge, intelligence. Talking to the people, bringing your expertise and understanding the underlying causes. The second angle is what? Understanding their capacity. Where do they get their weapons from? How do they recruit? Where do they get their funds from? Who is supporting them? Who is backing them? How do they carry out their attacks? You can use that also, to use your law enforcement to deal with that capacity. The third one is the last one is, making sure you can protect people, you can protect properties, so that when a terrorist has been able to acquire their motivation and capacity, they don't find an easy target. So when you look at the two triangles that I've spoken to you about, this is the basis of every government's national security strategy. And it is all about what? It's all about what I call the NIE, which is the National Intelligence Estimate. Every government has to develop a national intelligence estimate, and most of the African countries don't have one. If you have a national intelligence estimate, it will tell you the threats within your country, in your various states, and you can use those figures of your threats to be able to manage your capacity and your finances. So it is high time in 2022 we see governments building on their national intelligence estimates. We see governments looking at the triangle of knowledge, responsibility, and task. We see governments dealing with what I call the Otto's triangle. Look at all those issues, and I can tell you, again, that would be my advice. And I continuously say the same thing to governments. If you can build your national intelligence estimate, then your order of battle is going to be very, very easy. And I think, that's the same advice I give to the Ugandan and the Congolese government if they want to deal with the ADF.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Mr. Joseph.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time. I know. I think let us revisit this idea, because this
Yeah.
is what I see. What it is that many governments, they underestimate these rebel groups because they are fewer in numbers. The armed forces or government forces, they are bigger in number, and they have got all these firepower and stuff. So, as you have mentioned, for many governments, it's all about reacting. It is not actually going to eliminate their enemy. Because
Mm,
as you have just said, you see, how do you send 1,000 soldiers to fight 100 men
mm.
with so little resources? So I think that is the question really they have to ask themselves. All
And
that
it's
is the
very
situation.
expensive too, Mr. Joseph. It's very,
Yeah.
very expensive. And, so terrorist groups are forcing governments to to lose a lot of money. They will carry out an attack for $1. The government carries out an attack for 2 billion. And what does that say? It says that your strategy is wrong. Even if you manage to kill a few of them, then you spent more. It's an economic warfare as well. So the more governments get their strategies right, and understand how these groups operate, then the better for Africa for 2022.
Thank you. So I think we will be back next week. We want to look. We want to keep an eye on what is developing with the UDF and ADF in DRC.
We shall. Thank
yes.
you for the audience, and see you next week.
Next week, right. So here we go. Now, yes, and thank you very much for watching. We will be back again next week. We want to keep an eye on what is going on in all regions of Africa. We are not only to be going to talk about Uganda only, but David has raised a very, very important point. The rebels, they spend $1, governments, they spend billions. That is crippling the economy. Use intelligence. So, on that note, we will be back next week. And thank you for watching.